Well, hello, friends. Today I'm going to talk about how to install Linux on your computer. So, here's a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start off by first introducing what is Linux and going over that. Um, then, some reasons why you might want to consider installing and running Linux. I'll go through some advantages of Linux, some disadvantages of using Linux, really with the goal of giving you a kind of an idea of what you might be getting yourself into and whether it's worth the trouble. And then at the end, I'll go through an overview of the installation process, which is in a lot of ways fairly straightforward. Just by way of background, I'm not a software programmer or software developer, but I have been using Linux as a hobby now for a long time. I mean, this is probably now 20 years that I've been running it as my primary OS. So I'm coming at it from the perspective of a user. I'm not even sure I would call myself a power user at this point, but just someone who's familiar with it. So, what is Linux? The most straightforward definition I could find is that Linux is a free software operating system. Free software, also sometimes known as open source. Well, what does it mean to be free software? The man himself, Richard Stallman, the philosophical, technical, and I would say legal uh, creator of the software and this movement, defines it this way. Free software means that the users have the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software. Free software is a matter of liberty, not price. To understand the concept, you should think of free as in free speech, not as in free beer. However, due to the nature of software, I guess it should be noted that by enforcing your right or protecting your right to um, to use the software in any which way that you want, which includes the ability to study it, you have to be granted access to the source code, which basically has the practical upshot that the software also has to be freely available, free of cost. But the idea is that the philosophical grounding here is one of freedom, not necessarily of giving away something for free. So when I was putting all this together, it occurred to me that Linux, in a sense, is really defined by its software license. It's kind of a legal idea that incarnated itself or found its form as an operating system and as a whole set of and suite of software. Okay, so in the previous slide, I didn't highlight this, but Richard Stallman founded the GNU project in 1983. GNU, it's a recursive acronym, kind of nerd humor, stands for GNU's Not Unix. And that was a project to create a free software operating system. So there's an operating system that was built to those ideals of granting you rights. The software license under which all the software is issued is the GPL, the GNU Public License. Richard Stallman also calls this copyleft because it's the opposite of copyright. The way he describes it, copyrights are designed to limit your freedoms. Copyleft is designed to protect it. The basic upshot of copyleft is that the license allows you to use the software in any way you wish, for private use, for public use. You can make money out of it. Um, Really, the only limitation that copyleft imposes on you is if you want to use and make use of the sea of software that's been created by a community, the only thing you cannot do is take the code, put it behind a wall, and prevent others from using it, right? So that's the one, out of necessity, the one limitation that's placed on you. This software license and the whole idea was actually born out of the history of what happened with Unix. So Unix was another operating system, venerable operating system, still in use. Probably a lot of mainframes still use it. It was created by a bunch of volunteers collaborating, a spirit of free collaboration that was then co opted and essentially stolen by a big company. So In order to prevent that from happening again, um, is the software license of copyleft, or the GPL, and the whole GNU movement was started basically just as a response to what happened with Unix. So Linux looks a lot like Unix, but it's not Unix, right? So it's in the name. It's GNU, it's not Unix. This also means that the software development, instead of being done by a group of private um, employees of a corporation, as is the case with commercial software, is that this is a communal effort. The surprising thing, or what surprised me about this when I first found out about it, is that it works well. You end up with really high quality software. There's another big figure in the movement named Eric Raymond. He wrote a book called Cathedral and the Bazaar. He kind of goes into how the software model development works and why it works, if you're curious. But the basic upshot is that access to the source code, that's a prerequisite to uphold these ideas of copyleft, or the GPL, to protect your freedom. So, the hell is source code, right? Fair question. Now, I'm not a software developer, so this is maybe my understanding, my not very detailed understanding of it. So in the left, I show an example of a program, the source code to a program. I'm not sure what this program does. It's not relevant. The point is that the source code, when a programmer is putting together a program, he's working basically writing a text file that's designed to be human readable and understandable by humans. That is, the people, the programmers, or maybe even the users. This text file is not, it's not a program. It's not executable by a computer, but it does show you how the program will run and what it will do. And it's the text file that you need to be able to study and then modify the program itself. Now, the source code goes through a process shown in this blue arrow. That's supposed to represent a compiler. So a program called a compiler takes the source code and converts it into a binary file. Now, this is the actual executable program the computer runs. When you buy commercial software, or anything from Microsoft or Apple, what you get and what you purchase and what you download are binary files, right? The executable program. Now, if you were to try to open this up and view it, it would be unintelligible gibberish. So, and that's why the whole hang up about source code. If you have a piece of software, unless you have the source code from which that software was made, you cannot know or understand what the software is actually doing. You can't study to see how it works just for your own edification, or maybe to double check and verify that the software is actually doing what the seller claims it's doing. Also, the source code is what you would need to, if you wanted to say the program had a bug and you wanted to understand how why the program was failing, it would be the source code that you would go through to try to understand the logic, fix it, recompile, and create a new binary file. So that's kind of high level of what source code, what the source code is. So, overview of Linux today. I mentioned this GNU project in 1983. So basically, what happened, Richard Stallman and a whole community of people set out to create a completely free, as in free speech operating system, one where the users could understand and study every aspect of it. This culminated in an operating system that we now call Linux, or some people refer to it as GNU Linux, because it really was the outcome of the GNU project. It is the incarnation. It is the GNU project. So it does not carry Richard Stallman's name. It carries some other guy's name. The operating system is a vast collection of software. So you can imagine all the different pieces that form and compose an operating system, right? The text editor and the web browser, and all the drivers to operate the hardware, and it just goes on and on. So what happened is that people organized to form and package the software into groupings called distributions. And this was or distros if you're one of the cool kids. Now these distros make it easier for somebody else to come along and just make use of the software without you having to compile and assemble an entire operating system from scratch every time. And the reason that there's so many different distros is that they fill different needs, or people have simply different ideas of what a proper operating system could be. Since all the pieces are there and you can do whatever you want with it, people can and do tweak it endlessly, right? There's a website called DistroWatch, and when I checked it, it had 286 of the most popular distros, Linux distros out there. Truth of the matter is, a lot of them are probably not things that you may want to mess with. They might be specialized for running on unique ancient hardware, or maybe they're specific to running a server. Or what I provided here are the most popular distributions that you may be interested in checking out. Now, some of this is also colored by my own experience. I've run Fedora, I've run Ubuntu, I've run Linux Mint. I've never run Debian, but I know that's also one of the popular ones. So if you're considering Linux, I would suggest that these four might be a good place to start getting your toes wet. So what can you do with Linux? Pretty much anything you can do with a regular computer. In fact, a lot of really cool software that you may be used to using in your Apple or PC started off life as an open source kind of Linux app, if you will, that excelled and kicked so much butt that was ported over. Well, yeah, and the other thing too, since the source code is available, any programmer, even if they're a programmer who lives in the world of Windows, can take the source code and recompile it and make it run on Windows. So there's a lot of I was going to say cross-pollination, but it all moves in one direction, software moving out of Linux into the other realms. But examples are like the Mozilla Foundation and the Firefox browser, VLC, which was, basically became the premier media player in Linux. And I think it's probably one of the better media players that exists. Audacity for editing audio, the GIMP, which is a Photoshop clone is not the right word. I think it does a disservice to GIMP, but it's almost a feature complete alternative to Photoshop and completely open source. Then Brave software, the Brave browser, right, is kind of like the unevil version of Chrome. So some specific things that you can do with Linux: you can do video, audio, and image editing. Those aspects work well. You can draft documents. There's a complete Office suite that has pretty decent compatibility with Microsoft counterparts, Word and Excel, etc. You can work on spreadsheets. You can generate PDFs. You can play games. You can do 2 and 3D drafting. You can set up a server. You can set up a mail server, desktop, and surf the web, etc. Probably one of the biggest gaps is games. You can play games, and here I show an image of Tux Racer, which is probably the most popular game on Linux for a long time. It's a simple kind of racing game. But a lot of the AAA titles, if you're a gamer, that you can play on Windows or Apple computer, and are probably not going to be available. Steam recently committed to supporting the platform, so you can now install Steam and run Steam games. And just to highlight GIMP, here I'm showing the image or the Photoshop kind of alternative, the image editing software, and use that's a screenshot of that. All right, some benefits of Linux. Well, the first was the philosophical, right? The reason why Richard Stallman got this whole thing started in the first place. You control the computer. Okay? Without any source code, there's no way of knowing what the computer's actually doing. This means you can modify and tweak and break every single aspect of the operating system. So if you really want to geek out, there's no end to it. There's no part of the operating system or the computer that's locked out from you. Some people describe proprietary operating systems like buying a car with the hood welded shut, right? Now, most people don't care. They put in gas and then something goes wrong, they take it to a mechanic who, has a special way of opening the trunk, but you don't look underneath the trunk. Whereas there's people that like to get their hands dirty, understand how the engine works, and change their own oil. So this is kind of the equivalent of that. Linux lets you change your own. Linux lets you redesign and rebuild your own engine. I mean, it comes with the tools for you to do that. So that's what I mean by all the tools for software development are built in. So it's primarily originally created by software hackers, and it shows that heritage. However, you can also do as I have done, and I basically use the software as a non-technical user. I just prefer the environment. I prefer the stability. I prefer the security. I think it looks better. I find it frustrating to use other operating systems, right? So, and this is a quote that I thought was funny. The Microsoft job is where quality is job 1.1, right? It's an afterthought. So, and I think a lot of people just don't have a frame of reference, right? That's all they've ever used. But for me, it's been well. Let's say I've had a severe dislike of Bill Gates and Microsoft long before I knew he was a eugenicist, right? That just didn't help things. But comparing the two, it's hard to imagine how Microsoft's a viable company, much less a successful enterprise. Once you get a little perspective and you realize how they can't compete with, student hackers volunteering their time. And here's a cover to the book that I mentioned by Eric Raymond, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. So anyways, if you're at all interested in how this whole process works, this is it's a quick short read. So under benefits of Linux, so technical superiority. One of the things that I remember really struck with me was, in Windows, the file system fragments. So periodically, you have to run a defrag. You have to defrag your hard drive, right? Maybe Microsoft's finally addressed this, but from the beginning, 20 years ago, when Linux was running X2 as the file system, it was a file system that did not fragment. It just doesn't do that because that's retarded, right? Only Mickey Mouse operating systems have a file system that fragments. And it stuck in my mind. I thought it was very salient because why can't Microsoft do that with all its infinite funds, right? It's got, it's the most expensive component of a computer now is the freaking overpriced operating system. And they can't figure out how to create a file system that doesn't fragment, right? I still don't know if there's such a thing as a virus that's ever been spotted in the wild for Linux. Okay. That's kind of amazing. And then stability. So you'll get used to installing software that is version 0.3 and it runs great, better than Microsoft version 3.0 software, right? There's a quote that stuck with me: given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So it really has to do with this open source development. It really does lend itself to really high quality software, and those kind of counterintuitive. It's got a big following and a large community base. So, there's a lot of support if you really want to dig into it. And then the other thing that sold me originally when I started dipping my toes into it is how cool it looks, right? And since every aspect of it is malleable and there's a huge community of people all doing crazy things with it and sharing what they're doing with it because of copyleft, it means that you have almost infinite options as to how your operating system looks and runs. There's some drawbacks to Linux. Just about every commercial piece of software that you might be interested in running probably won't run on Linux. Now that's it's an ever increasingly insignificant problem, right? So if there's a need, almost always a group of people, come together and address it, and that need is met. But it will mean that you may have to learn to use a different program than what you're used to. So hardware is not officially supported for the most part. This is changing. But again, what this has meant traditionally is that the software hackers got together and reversed engineered all the drivers that are required to run a computer. And again, I used to do experiments and tests where we would have the computer running the official codecs, the official drivers, right? And then a Linux machine running its reversed engineered drivers. And it's amazing how often the reversed engineered drivers were more stable and ran better. But it does mean that you should but there's no guarantee that your hardware will be supported. That's the upshot, right? You buy something for Windows, they expect you to run Windows. It comes with a CD, or you can go to the manufacturer's website, download drivers because they've tested their hardware, right, to work with Windows. That's what they assume you run. Linux, you don't have that, right? So you have to wait until there's a community or some hacker also bought that peripheral and made it work. So, but it's not catastrophic. It just means that you have to maybe spend 5 minutes on the web before you buy hardware. A lot of the older software developed for Windows, well, pretty much all software developed for Windows will not run. However, you do have some alternatives to run some of the older software, like Wine, which is another recursive acronym, right? Wine is not an emulator. That's what Wine stands for. But it allows you to run Windows programs on Linux in a limited way. But this is primarily true of older, smaller software. It's tricky getting AAA titles to run. So if gaming's your thing, you might be living with Windows for a little bit longer. And probably the biggest drawback is that Linux does not come pre-installed on your computer, unlike Windows. So you are going to have to roll up your sleeves and install it yourself. So an overview of installing Linux. The easiest way to install Linux is to run a live CD on a computer and set aside a machine that you're going to dedicate to run Linux. That way, if the install fails or you screw something up, it's not catastrophic. Don't use your production servers, is what I'm saying. Don't attempt this on the PC where you keep all your family pictures. You can dedicate a separate machine to it. That's the way to go. Now, I mentioned a live CD. This is Wikipedia. It's useful, Wikipedia, for these definitions. So this is where I got this from. Very succinct. A live CD is a complete bootable operating system which runs directly from a CD-ROM into a computer's memory rather than loading from a hard disk drive. A live CD allows you to run an operating system for any purpose without installing it or making changes to the computer. So that's kind of cool. What this is saying is you can, and what I'm going to show is you stick a thumb drive into the computer, it boots from that thumb drive, so you're not altering in any way your laptop, so nothing's at risk. If for whatever reason it doesn't recognize or work or play nice with your hardware, no harm done. You just turn it off, unplug the USB drive, and it's as if though nothing happened. And the reason this is advantageous is you run the live CD and you use that to install the operating system. Okay, so installing Linux. Our overview, here are our goals. Okay, you're going to download the Linux OS. You're going to copy that software, that operating system, into a bootable thumb drive. You're going to boot Linux from this thumb drive. Then you can get to play with Linux, kick the tires, explore the operating system, see if it's to your liking. And once that's up and running, you use this live CD image to install Linux permanently, your hard drive. So, and that's what I show in this image, right? This, by the way, I failed to mention, but you're seeing a lot of penguins. That's the official mascot of Linux. It's Tux, the penguin. And here you see him holding a thumb drive that was used to install, I think this is Ubuntu, this laptop. It's a common way of doing it. That's how things are done now. And it's called a live CD. A little anachronistic back when it was actually done from CD. So this is really old. Now, well, use thumb drives because, well, who's got a CD burner anymore? Okay, so for step one, you're going to pick a distribution or a distro and download the most recent version. Yeah, there's no sense in using old software. Now, oftentimes, these distributions come in different variants or flavors, and each flavor serving a different purpose. So maybe one is for older machines that don't have a lot of computing power, maybe one's for desktops, maybe one's intended for servers, etc. Like, as long as you're not dealing with a really ancient piece of computer, I'm going to recommend Linux Mint Cinnamon. Ubuntu LTS desktop is also a fine choice. But I'm most fully familiar with Linux Mint Cinnamon. So that's what I'll be showing here. You're going to download an ISO file. It's going to be a single file that contains the entire operating system in a bootable image. It's about 2 gigabytes in size, so you need a thumb drive that's at least that big. You go to linuxmint.com. This is what that website looks like. You'll see that it's got a lot of information. You can browse and look around, but when you're ready to install, you go to the download tab. This is what the download page looks like. You scroll down and you get to the download links, and you see they have different flavors, like I mentioned, cinnamon, mate, and XFCE. I recommend cinnamon, 64-bit probably. You click on that, and you'll download a 2 gigabyte ISO image. Now, the next step, and I'm assuming you're running Windows, by the way, but I think the software also runs on Apple. You get Rufus. So you go to rufus.ie. And so Rufus, what it's going to do is going to allow you to create a bootable USB drive the easy way. You scroll down to the download link, get the latest version of it. This is what the program looks like once it's up and running. In this top window, it shows under device, that's where you point to your USB thumb drive that you've plugged into your Windows machine. Boot selection, you navigate to where you downloaded that .iso file. And you leave the other two, you don't have to touch those, but partition scheme is master boot record, MBR, target system, BIOS, or UEFI, that's fine. You hit start, and it transfers this ISO file to your thumb drive. All right, so far so good. So this is where we go to boot the Life CD. You insert the USB drive into the computer. You turn off the machine and you turn it back on. The goal is to get the computer to boot Linux from this thumb drive. Most likely, you will need to edit your computer BIOS setting. Okay? This is likely your biggest technical challenge in installing Linux. It's actually not hard. May require persistence. And if you still have the documentation to your computer, that will be useful. Now, this image is Knoppix. This was the first Life CD. This was the first time somebody actually created one. And I guess I should explain what's happening here. A Life CD boots Windows, and while it's booting, it's detecting and automatically configuring your hardware as it boots into a fully functional operating system with your video card recognized and the appropriate drivers installed and running, and all the drivers for your Ethernet card and sound. I mean, the first time I saw this, my jaw hit the floor, right? Let's watch Windows do this. And actually, I think Windows recently has come out with something similar, but, about 20 years later. So Knoppix should get some credit. I think it's a distro out of Germany. It's the first time somebody slapped this together. But anyway, so that's what we're going to try to do. So I mentioned the BIOS. What's the BIOS? It's called, it stands for Basic Input Output System. It's part of your firmware. So this is the operating system of your motherboard, if you will. That's kind of in a way. You normally don't see it because the computer turns on, the BIOS activates, and it's the BIOS that loads your operating system. So by the time you see that Apple or Windows splash screen as your computer's booting, the BIOS has done its thing. So we need to access this thing to tell it, hey, I know you like booting from the hard drive, but we want you to boot from the thumb drive instead. Okay, this sounds more intimidating than what it is. The only thing that's tricky about this is that the BIOS is almost always unique to each computer. Each year they make updates. There's different manufacturers or people who are creating the BIOS, I guess, for different motherboards, etc. So I can't show you step by step on how to access your BIOS, but there are some commonalities. The BIOS is almost always accessed while the computer turns on. Prior to it launching Windows, or, well, yeah, we're probably talking about Windows, you have to press a button. The other thing to keep in mind is that the BIOS is designed for you to access it. So if you've ever installed an operating system, I'm belaboring a point because you know what I'm talking about. If you've never installed an operating system, which is maybe the majority of computer users, don't despair. This thing is designed to be accessed, right? So I mentioned the button. Okay, well, which button? That's the question. So if you have the documentation, I suggest you track it down and consult it. Otherwise, common buttons that you press short to interrupt the booting process and to enter into the BIOS include F1, F2, delete, F10, F12, maybe the tab key. Acer and some Dell models don't like their users very much, and they require Control Alt plus Enter, etc. But I would say that the first, on that first line, F1, F2, delete, F10, F12, tab, that's probably 90% of the computer. So you hit the power button, the computer starts booting, you press F1, F2, you try these things. Oh, shoot, Windows is loading. So we didn't enter into BIOS. You turn it off, you turn it back on again. Now you try F10, F12, tab, right? Until you get into this other window. So if you don't have the documentation, and I never have it, it's never handy, I resort to guesswork, right? So it's a little iterative process. Might require a couple of cycles of powering on and off. It's actually not difficult. It's just slightly annoying and might require some persistence. But once you access the BIOS, and like I said, it's not like something that's on super lockdown. You just need to figure out which is the right magic key to get to it. You're looking for the boot order. That's your watchword. Okay, the PC is almost certainly set to default. By default, look for an operating system in the hard drive first and only. So your goal here is to tell it to look for an operating system in the US drive before it goes looking for it in the hard drive. So here's a screenshot of an HP computer I found online. You can see here it was under storage boot order. That's where you want to go. Here's another. This is also an HP computer. You can see it's a little bit fancier BIOS, but it's still the same thing. You're looking for boot order. Here's another example of what the BIOS may look like. And here they've navigated to boot. You see first boot device, hard drive, second boot device, CD-ROM, third boot device, the removal device. See, this isn't going to work. You want removal device as the first boot device, right? Otherwise, this computer would just go back to Windows and load that. Never find your Linux thumb drive. And by the way, you don't have to change this back when you're done, right? So normally then, after you install Linux and there's no thumb drive in there, the computer will go through this process of, is there anything in the USB drive? Nope. Okay, then let's move on to the hard drive. So it actually bugs me a little bit that computer should be by default set to look for removable devices. But anyway, they don't assume you're going to run anything other than Windows. So some general tips, all right, for the BIOS issue. Use a USB slot. That's actually mounted on your PC. Don't go through a USB hub. Sometimes for whatever reason that's just not detected, and the computer can't load it unless it's from a local USB slot. Leave your USB thumb drive plugged in while you poke around the BIOS. Especially for newer machines, the BIOS will not show you the option for removable drive booting unless the thumb drive is plugged in. And in fact, it may even give you the option to boot now, but the thumb drive needs to be plugged in there. So what you're looking for is the boot sequence, and you will see hard drive. I mean, obviously it's booting from the hard drive, but these are kind of things to look for, right? And you want to make sure, again, to reiterate that removable device or USB drive is at the top of the list, so it checks there first. All right, so that's the technical challenge. It's actually not that difficult. It's just maybe annoying and maybe a little mysterious if you haven't done it before, but you can do it, right? It's not, you're not doing calculus here, right? And prepare for magic, because that's the good news. Once you get over that, what you're going to see is Linux detecting, auto-configuring your hardware while it boots. That's amazing, man. That is incredible. That's really cool. And you're talking a bunch of volunteers, computer savvy nerds doing this on their own spare time, and you have this technical feat. Now, it will boot into a fully functional operating system that doesn't touch your hard drive. So at this point, you can just play around with it, make sure that it detects all your hardware and everything's working properly. So that gives you some assurance that when you do go to install it, everything will work. If it attempts to boot and it gives you errors, or for whatever reason it's not working, the easiest fallback is to, if you went through and installed Linux Mint, like I showed you, maybe try Ubuntu LTS, or try Fedora, or try Debian, right? Try some of the other common distros. There might be some particular aspect to your laptop or computer that, the Live CD doesn't like, and the other Live CD installer will work. Now, having said that, I can't remember the last time I had the Live CD not work. So, but that's just been my experience. So, this is what it looks like when it boots. So this is your Linux Mint Cinnamon desktop. Now, this has been, it gets criticized for looking too much like Windows. And it's true. It probably helps ease the transition. So I don't think it's necessarily anything bad. I dislike and abhor everything about Microsoft and its operating system. But truth be told, I guess I'm so used to it, I don't mind the fact that it kind of looks like it. So I will just point out two things. One, there's your start menu. And then from here, you can access all the software that's currently installed on your computer. You can browse through it and click around. The other thing I want to point out is that there's 3 icons by default on your desktop: computer, home, and this blue CD looking thing that says install Linux Mint. So computer, you would click on that. You can browse if there's different hard drives, or you can see the hardware configuration. Home folder is a Linux specific thing or a Unix thing. That's where all your user files typically go. So it's an important folder. For the Live CD, there's nothing going to be in there, but if this is your permanent install, that's where all your documents and pictures and everything that's not the operating system goes in the home folder. So that's why it's on the desktop. It's an important folder otherwise. So you play around with it. Maybe you think it's cool. Maybe it sucks, whatever. But if you do decide you like it and you want to install it, you double click on this install Linux Mint icon. Now, I guess it's worth highlighting here, before you go through this, back up any information you may think you may want to keep. Okay? Because when you start this process is when you start modifying our hard drive. So I thought it was funny. You cross your fingers, you double click on install Linux Mint, and let's go. Well, maybe anticlimactic, but it's a GUI and it's an installer. So you select your language. This is what launches, right? English. Okay. This is pretty easy. Connect to the internet. Optional but useful. So you're probably at home. You probably know your own password. This is where you enter it. And the installer can update the software as part of the install process, which is useful. This might be surprising. They have a button. Why is this even an option? You want to install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi, Flash, MP3. It's basically proprietary software that Linux Mint cannot ship, right? Because it's not theirs. So these are all proprietary codecs that are normally downloadable for free, right? They're free as in free beer, not free as in free speech, because they're locked down and whatever. So somebody like Richard Stallman, and I think this is the source of some of his criticism, he's a man of principle. So he would say, screw that, man. You don't need MP3. There's an open source music format that's superior in just by any metric, and it's free, right? It's called OGG, OGG. And then same thing for everything else. The reality is, though, most of us have an MP3 collection, and we need to communicate with other people. So you're going to leave this button pressed, and it will go through and install these proprietary bits of software that, if you're really concerned about the integrity of your software, you wouldn't install, right? The moment, and this is why, the moment you install this proprietary software, well, again, now, could be a Trojan horse, especially anything from Microsoft. But, you're kind of balancing things out. So, believe it or not, that's a controversial button in Linux, but just everybody, unless you're Richard Stallman, you probably leave that checked. Okay, now it's getting serious. Choose an installation type. You can see there's two options here: erase disk and install Linux Mint, or something else. Now, if this is a computer that's going to be dedicated to running Linux, the most obvious and simplest thing to do is you click that top button. All right. All the data will be lost on a hard drive. Select this option. Right? This will wipe Windows in seconds. GNU Linux antiviral formula. Free your PC. I thought this was funny. Now, assuming you know what you're doing, you can do something else and hit next. If you do something else, this is what happens. You end up with a graphical representation of the hard drive, so you can delete and move partitions, define new ones. If you don't know what any of this means, don't worry about it. Just do that standard install, and it'll just wipe the entire hard drive and install Linux on it for you. What this is showing is that it's got an existing Windows 7 operating system. The installer has recognized this, and either the user or the installer here is getting ready to install Linux on the partition dev SDA4. So, and I'm just showing this for those of you that know what a partition is, or you want to know. This is where you can manually really roll up your sleeves and really wreck things, or set them up just so. But I'll leave you with this. Linux requires at least one partition defined as the root / directory, and that's what we see here, right? Dev SDF4, it's got that root mount point. The operating system requires about 15 gigs. Obviously, you want more than that for your user data. ext4 is recommended as the file system, but there's others you can choose from. It's actually kind of cool. There's some file systems designed for servers. If they're accessing a lot of files, small files, for instance, they're a little bit faster. But ext4 it's pretty good. It's got like I said, it doesn't fragment, because only Mickey Mouse operating systems have such ridiculously bad things as a fragmenting file system. It's got error correcting. It's got encryption. It's supported. It's pretty good. So it's probably a good default for most. A separate swap partitions also recommended, not mandatory. As an aside, so if you've got a machine with Windows on it, and I didn't want to talk about this because I honestly wouldn't recommend it for a first-time install, but maybe it's not your first time or you're adventurous. The installer will detect that there's an operating system here, and it will ask you, do you want me to install Linux alongside it? And you can just hit this option and let it do its thing. The reason I wouldn't recommend it is I have run into problems where the installer maybe didn't set things up right, or didn't set them up the way I would set them up. So I don't want to promise that this will work for you, but it's there as an option if you choose to try it. So this is just in case you have a PC with Windows on it. This is your test PC. You're going to install Linux. It will ask, you want me to install Linux alongside your existing OS? You can either choose to say, nope, wipe the hard drive clean, let's start from scratch, or you can attempt to do this. So what it will attempt to do is it will attempt to resize your existing operating system to make room and install Linux Mint automagically. And then what will happen is you turn on your computer, a boot menu will offer you a choice between Windows and Linux. But I have to mention it because you will see this. It will ask you, but Not necessarily what I would recommend for the first time. Okay, so once you get past the partitioning, select your time zone, your keyboard layout, right? All these options, English, US. As if you got a programmer DevRack keyboard with dead keys. Crazy. Okay, details. This matters. So this is where you would fill out your name. More importantly, though, this is where you would pick a username and your password. Here's also where you get the option to encrypt your home folder. This is to protect your personal data against local attacks. That's people around you or in case your computer gets stolen. However, don't forget your password, right? So you can encrypt your home folder, and then if you get amnesia or you change your password and you forget to write it down, you're screwed, buddy. There's no recovering that. So, but it is as an option. You can encrypt it and protect yourself. And then at this point, there's a slideshow. It shows you some benefits and features while it copies all the files that it needs to copy to finish the install. This is the message that you get when the installation finishes. You can continue testing Linux Mint, or you can choose to restart. So it will ask you to remove the CD or DVD, or actually probably, thumb drive in this example. The computer should reboot to a working Linux operating system. So now that it's installed, I would suggest you explore, click, adjust the operating system to make it look and behave the way you want. There's more configurability than you're probably used to. Almost every aspect of the OS can be adjusted. You can make it look like a Windows machine or a Macintosh or something else entirely. You're not likely to break anything as a user, so I would say click away with abandon. What Windows calls the administrator is called a root or root user in Linux. So you will need to log on as root to do administrative tasks, modify system files, install new software, etc. The only caution I would give is root has the ability to do anything, including deleting itself or deleting the OS. So never run the computer as a root. You should run it as your user and only change into the root user when you want to do something. And it's pretty smart. It'll prompt you. So you try to install some software. It'll prompt you for your password that you're really sure. And then it'll, run as in root mode, complete the task, and then drop you back into user mode typically. So, and in fact, it's behavior that Windows copied, right, in later OSs. That was part of the problem with Windows. Well, one of the many problems. One of the most glaring problems with it was that early Windows, you just ran as administrator. Linux, may the source be with you. Now you know where that. You'll see that phrase. Now you know where that comes from. And that's it. I hope this has helped somebody. But any questions? I like talking about this. I like playing with this. So, this goes out to anybody in autonomy or really anyone else who wants to install Linux. I would love to help in any way that I can. All right.